In the mid-60s, the Snowdons were by far and away the most glamorous members of the royal family. Super modern, they took up water skiing. All the happening people of the day turned up at their legendary parties. Rudolf Nureyev, Frank Sinatra, the Beatles, Mary Quant, Hollywood royalty.
I remember going for dinner when they had Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor, and it was a mixture of all sorts of, particularly the artistic world, but I don't think she would have known so many of them if it hadn't been for Tony, and she really enjoyed meeting all those different people, and a lot of them became great friends, like Peter Sellers.
Princess Margaret was happy to party with Tony's friends, but she could never forget she was royal, and no one else was allowed to forget it either.
The only disconcerting thing most people found about them when they came to dinner was that she was a very, very fast eater, and you're not supposed to eat after royalty have finished. And so most people never got much of a first course. Luckily, she then took a break for smoking so you could catch up.
If you overstepped that mark, became a little too familiar, perhaps, then she would become very royal and very grand, and you would be put in your place. And this, very often, it could be with just a look, it could be with a withering remark. Her very bright blue eyes would turn icy, and you had gone too far.
Friends noticed that Tony was beginning to find his wife's high and mighty ways annoying. And after 4 or 5 years, the novelty of royal life was wearing thin.
It irritated the hell out of him. He couldn't do with all that etiquette. He got very dragged down by it sometimes, and I'm sure he felt irked by it when he really wanted to do things that he couldn't.
It became known on the Sunday Times that Lord Snowdon liked to go on trips abroad. Princess Margaret, who filled her spare time with little hobbies, was on her own more and more.
She didn't like it at all. And she would ring up while he was at work, and I would generally have to answer the phone and say that he was doing the pictures and he couldn't come to the telephone. So it was quite difficult having to make some excuse.
Princess Margaret began to have a very shrewd suspicion that when he was away on his travels, he was, so to speak, playing away. And I think there may well have been a bit of truth in that.
The more Tony cut loose, the more insecure Princess Margaret became. The couple started having blistering rows, even in public, and Tony treated his wife dismissively, as witnessed at a party by Mary Gilliatt.
About 1 o'clock, Tony came up to us and said, "Would you mind driving me home? I'm feeling rather tired and I've got a very early appointment in the morning." And we said, "What about Princess Margaret?" And he said, "Oh, she's fine, she's fine."
Tony left his wife behind. Once back at Kensington Palace, Tony, no longer tired, kept the Gilliatts chatting.
Suddenly the doors flung open and there was Princess Margaret in floods of tears. I mean, she was really crying. And I thought, this is extraordinary to have the Queen's sister sobbing on my shoulder because her husband had left her at a party. We began then to realise that, you know, there really were great strains in the marriage.
The Snowdons' friends, the Stephens, saw Tony's increasing hostility towards his wife when they went on holiday together in 1965.
They'd had a slight difference of agreement about something, and Tony decided to climb up onto the roof. We got a telephone call where we were staying from Princess Margaret saying, "Please come and help me, because Tony's on the roof and we can't get him down."
Jocelyn Stevens went out and said to him, "You know, what's happening here?" And Tony said, "It's the only place I can get away from the bloody woman."
Although there were rumours of marriage difficulties, the physical side of the Snowdons' relationship remained strong. But as well as sex, Princess Margaret wanted emotional intimacy. In a note to her husband, she said that she hated the silent treatment and the dreaded fed-up sighs, and wanted nice, cosy affection.
I think Princess Margaret would actually quite have liked to have had a heart-to-heart talk with Tony about this. But as she once put it to me, he never wanted to have that sort of thing. He'd always leave the room.
Princess Margaret became more and more possessive and demanding. She begged Tony to stay with her, but he insisted on going on long work trips abroad. Deeply unhappy, she had a couple of brief affairs.
Princess Margaret was not naturally an unfaithful person. And had she not felt neglected by Tony, then I don't think she would have had these relationships. She said, it became an open marriage and it was not something I really wanted to be a party to.
Tony reacted to his wife's infidelity by retreating even more from her. He threw himself into making TV documentaries. Moved by his childhood experience of polio, he became a passionate campaigner for the disabled and designed a special chair.
It started about 3 years ago when I did the first prototype, which was an ordinary plastic mobile platform for Quint crew.
When he wasn't working, Tony asserted his independence from his wife by doing up a derelict property, Old House in Sussex, which belonged to his family, including digging a lake.
He did it in a sort of secret way. He didn't really get her interested in it, and I don't think she felt that she was part of it at all. So she really wasn't so happy about being there or having anything to do with it.
In Sussex, Tony became friendly with his neighbours, the Marquis and Marchioness of Reading, and particularly with their daughter.
She was heaven, Jackie. Tall and leggy and funny and naughty and still is, and this rather dirty laugh and wrinkles up her nose, and she was divine. She was quite hippie too. I mean, she was completely unconventional, Jackie. He loved that sort of rebel side of Jackie.
No one had more of a ringside seat on the activities of his masters than Princess Margaret's chauffeur, John Larkin. One day she told him to drive her to Tony's bolt hole for an unscheduled visit.
He said, very well, Your Royal Highness, and he thought, oh dear, here's trouble, because he slightly knew that things were not quite what they seemed. And he thought, how do I warn Lord Snowdon? What do I do? And coming up the drive, he did the only thing he could think of. He flashed his headlights on and off very, very quickly. And duly, Tony appeared at the door, embraced Princess Margaret warmly, said, darling, how lovely to see you. Then he looked straight at John Larkin and said, Larkin, the Aston needs filling up. And John Larkin, who was knew perfectly well there was petrol in the tank of the Aston Martin, said, very good, my lord, and drove it off to the nearest village. When he got there, he stopped, opened the boot, and out hopped Jackie.
Tony, now 39, was having a passionate affair with a woman 16 years his junior. But ironically, his standing in the royal family couldn't have been better.
Tony was always very careful. He was very fond of the Queen and the Queen Mother, and he was always very nice to them. Very nice.
Whatever they knew about problems in his marriage, the Queen and Queen Mother were sympathetic to Tony.
There was definitely this feeling amongst the family that because Margaret could be difficult, because she was rather temperamental, that it was more her fault than Tony's.
In 1969, the Queen made her respect for Tony clear when she asked him to stage the investiture of Prince Charles.
He was a good choice. He's a designer, had a great sense of theatre, was married to the Queen's sister, got himself up in some very smart uniform. It went extremely well. And I think at that stage the royal family were very supportive of him.
Tony pulled off a brilliant modern take on royal pageantry, but behind the scenes his private life was falling apart. His relationship with Jackie was widely known, and in January 1971 the papers threatened to break the story. All concerned denied it. Then Jackie confessed the truth to her horrified parents.
The Readings were incandescent. They obviously forbade Jackie to have anything more to do with him, and they completely brought down the shutters on their friendship with Tony. This whole episode was very upsetting indeed. He felt life again was closing in on him, and he began to feel a sort of sense of despair, you know.
Tony took out his frustrations on his wife.
A close friend of the princess's told me that Princess Margaret was convinced that on the morning she had some frightfully important engagement in the evening. That is when Tony would engineer a row so that her eyes were red and swollen for the evening.
Tony would leave nasty notes for Princess Margaret, perhaps in the book she was reading or in her glove drawer. And the most famous was one that said, "You look like a Jewish manicurist, and I hate you."
Tony's behaviour towards Princess Margaret stemmed from his childhood experience of an absent mother.
He found it, to some kind of subconscious level, very difficult to trust women. There was always a sense of testing the boundaries, seeing how far you could go, and perhaps pushing and pushing, just to see, will that person give way or crack or break or go over the edge or whatever. And of course, if you go on and on and on, very often they do.
To those close to him, it seemed that Tony was hell-bent on destroying his marriage. Unknown to the general public, he now began an affair with his future wife, divorcee Lucy Lindsay Hogg, with whom he worked. He spent much of his time at her flat, just around the corner from Kensington Palace. Princess Margaret knew all about it.
She became desperately unhappy. She started to put on weight. She started to drink too much. And there were tearful midnight conversations, and sometimes a little bit later with friends, with ladies in waiting. She was very, very unhappy, very low, very lonely.
Too late, Princess Margaret was confronting what marriage to a man like Tony meant.
I think that probably fate hung a bit heavy over it from the beginning. He had a roving eye, and I think that Princess Margaret might have had as well.
In 1973, Margaret, deeply hurt by Tony's rejection of her, found comfort in a relationship with a man some 17 years her junior, Roddy Llewellyn.
Paradoxically, we find that Tony resents the presence of Roddy in the princess's life like mad. "Tell your friend to keep out of my house," he said.
But for Princess Margaret, Roddy was just what she needed. In early 1976, she took him to her holiday home on the Caribbean island of Mustique. The News of the World splashed a photograph of them on its front page. Tony finally had his get-out-of-jail card.
When Tony saw the photograph, this was too much for him. It was one thing that he actually felt he could not tolerate, and at the same time, he could leave with the feeling that he could justifiably claim that he was the injured party.
The couple's separation would be announced on the 19th of March 1976. Back then, a royal divorce, the first for 400 years, was a nightmare for the monarchy. The princess was blamed.
The public actually didn't like what they saw. It's the old thing, isn't it, of the older woman and the younger man. But it, in fact, really kind of damaged Princess Margaret's standing. Irreparably.
Meanwhile, Tony arrived in Australia, where he was making a film, and held an impromptu press conference.
I'm naturally desperately sad in every way that this had to happen.
Princess Margaret was supposed to have commented that she'd never seen such good acting. However, most people felt sorry for Lord Snowdon, the wronged husband.
Well, Princess Margaret, her press wasn't very friendly. And, as someone said, Tony came out of it smelling of roses.
Tony would continue his relationship with Lucy. Princess Margaret would continue to be vilified, despite the fact that her relationship with Roddy ended in 1980. Now approaching 50, Tony had escaped from the confines of royal life. But in the years to come, revelations would emerge that would put Margaret's indiscretions in the shade, including one from the time of their engagement that would have rocked the royal marriage to its foundations. When Princess Margaret and Tony Snowdon divorced in 1978, she was devastated. Divorce went against her religious beliefs and her sense of duty as a member of the royal family. Over the years, her health deteriorated.
She was much more miserable and showed her misery after they split up. And she often used to ring us up quite late, about 2 in the morning or something, and say, could we go round and things. I imagine she did that lots before. She got really, really lonely and sad.
Meanwhile, Tony's career went from strength to strength. He jetted around the world, photographing everyone who was anyone.
What I found amazing is that Snowdon, on the whole, was far more famous as an individual, both as a photographer and somebody in British society, than the people we photographed. So immediately people were in awe of the photographer. I think he was very keen to just strip that away, actually, and get to the soul of the person.
But apart from the celebrity photography, Tony was busy on another front. He set up the Snowdon Awards, which helped disabled young people, and continued to produce campaigning photographs highlighting the plight of the dispossessed and the desperately ill.
We've always called it the Madonna in Shards because it really symbolised what we wanted to show, which was the compassion that there was amidst all the misery and the sadness. And he is passionate about disabled people.
Crucially, Tony had remained on good terms with the royal family, who were grateful to him for never having spilled the beans.
There are so many things he could have written about, could have said, so many remarks, so many disclosures about the royal family, and he absolutely never has. He did keep his mouth absolutely shut.
Tony's marriage to Lucy seemed much less volatile, but away from the public gaze, Tony hadn't changed. History was repeating itself. He was up to his old tricks.
One of his assistants once said to me, Tony was absolutely brilliant at keeping a lot of balls in the air at once, like a juggler, but just occasionally something would go wrong. And just like with a juggler, if he misses one, the whole lot crashed to the floor and there's a good deal of fallout. Well, this has happened once or twice in Tony's life.
On New Year's Eve 1996, a journalist called Anne Hills committed suicide. She'd worked with Tony on his campaigns for the disabled, but the papers revealed that Tony had been having an affair with her throughout his marriage to Lucy.
It was a very obviously a very delicate time, very tricky time, and ended up talking about it, Tony and I. Again, very difficult because at some point someone had to make a decision whether it was going to be a divorce, whether it was going to be, a moving out. There had to be a reaction. And I got the feeling Tony had a sort of rather French view to the whole thing. Well, these things happened, and maybe very selfish and very, very male.
Still, Lucy stayed with Tony. But now, aged 67, he was about to make headlines again. He embarked on another affair, this time with Melanie Cable Alexander, over 30 years his junior, who became pregnant. Tony's son Jasper was born in April 1998.
I think it completely threw him. The whole thing actually was rather vulgar in a sense that maybe in the past relationships were between the adults involved, and yes, people got hurt along the way, but it was never as public. I think that was all very unexpected.
Lucy moved out.
I mean, that Tony, until recently, was very restless. And when other women were involved, let alone a child, I don't think she could stand it anymore.
But an even greater revelation has only just emerged. Jasper is not Tony's only love child. Just 3 weeks after Tony's marriage to Margaret in 1960, his close friend Camilla Fry, hostess of freewheeling, lively house parties, had given birth to a daughter, Polly. Friends had hinted to her that Tony, not Jeremy Fry, might be her father. Now in her 40s, she came to see him.
She said, "Can we settle it one day or another?" And he said, "Yes." And they each took a DNA test, and he was the father. I mean, it was very surprising to realise that Polly had actually been conceived while Tony was seeing Princess Margaret.
The truth about Polly's paternity has only just been publicly confirmed. But true to form, Lord Snowdon remains silent. And so Princess Margaret, who died in 2002, was unaware that her husband's first child was conceived around the time of their engagement. Tony is now 78, but friends testify to his enduring ability to put the past behind him and move on.
If he has had bad and unhappy moments and he thinks, well, that's it, been through that, done that, I can't do anything about it, it's happened, I must move on and to the next thing. He's that sort of person, I think. Now, he's done quite a bit of moving on. He's a free spirit, Tony, and always has been.
Tony Snowdon's childhood experience of an absent mother and serious illness shaped his personality and fueled his determination to succeed. But the same forces made him incapable of fidelity and ultimately destroyed his marriages. One of his best friends described Tony as maddening, stubborn and wayward, forever doing the unexpected. Life with him may have been hell at times, but it was never boring. And perhaps that's what Princess Margaret wanted. Whether that's what she needed is another matter.
It could be with just a look. It could be with a withering remark. Her very bright blue eyes would turn icy. And you had gone too far.
Friends noticed that Tony was beginning to find his wife's high and mighty ways annoying. And after 4 or 5 years, the novelty of royal life was wearing thin.
It irritated the hell out of him. He couldn't do with all that etiquette. He got very dragged down by it sometimes, and I'm sure he felt irked by it when he really wanted to do things that he couldn't.
It became known on the Sunday Times that Lord Snowdon liked to go on trips abroad. Princess Margaret, who filled her spare time with little hobbies, was on her own more and more.
She didn't like it at all. And she would ring up while he...
In the mid-60s, the Snowdons were by far and away the most glamorous members of the royal family. Super modern, they took up water skiing. All the happening people of the day turned up at their legendary parties. Rudolf Nureyev, Frank Sinatra, the Beatles, Mary Quant, Hollywood royalty.
I remember going for dinner when they had Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor, and it was
to eat after royalty had finished. And so most people never got much of a first course. Luckily, she then took a break for smoking so you could catch up.
If you overstepped that mark, became a little too familiar, perhaps, then she would become very royal and very grand, and you would be put in your place. And this, very often...
a mixture of all sorts of, particularly the artistic world, but I don't think she would have known so many of them if it hadn't been for Tony, and she really enjoyed meeting all those different people, and a lot of them became great friends, like Peter Sellers.
Princess Margaret was happy to party with Tony's friends, but she could never forget she was royal, and no one else was allowed to forget it either.
The only disconcerting thing most people found about them when they came to dinner was that she was a very, very fast eater, and you're not supposed